For exam 3, it's going to be, again, 20 multiple choice questions. There'll be 3 vocabulary words that you'll have to give the definition, and then there'll be a series of short answer questions. In one of the short answer questions, I'm going to ask for your opinion, and I expect that you'll back it up with 3 facts. So I want to tell you right up front, it doesn't matter to me what your opinion is. What I'm interested in is how well you argue your opinion. So you can take multiple sides of the issue, and all of them can be full credit answers. It all depends on the quality of the information that you use to support your opinion. So now let's talk about the material for the exam. For the midstream issue, conceptually, it's important that you understand the difference between gas and oil. We talk about how the product primarily moves, and again, you see a difference between gas, oil, and other liquid products. Make sure that you recall why rail increased so much in this time frame, and also why rail doesn't tend to be popular over time. The concept of batching is useful to understand. And then as far as the pipelines go, nothing specifically about the mileage, distance, or anything like that, but understand that there is a greater variance in demand for natural gas than for oil, and because of that, you have to have storage solutions. No specific questions about any of the companies, but then how it can affect profitability. This is an important discussion to recall. What happened in the Permian Basin and the price differentials, and why that happened, and then why it changed. Again, you should recall that from the presentation. You go back and watch the video on that. As far as LNG goes, when does exporting it make sense? When does importing it make sense? What are the countries that import quite a bit of LNG? Remember that the liquefaction process and building the facilities, and they're called trains to do the liquefaction process, is by far the most expensive part of it. And then, even though they prefer to deal on long-term contracts, the market has forced them to shift to more spot contracts, which is problematic because the liquefaction cost is so high. That's it for the midstream section. I'll tell you well, we'll get into the downstream section next. On to the downstream industry. Again, remember that the downstream industry primarily is concerned with oil products because, excuse me, natural gas products go directly to the market. And so, remember that the downstream industry is the purchaser of the crude, and then they turn it into refined products. Definitely going to want to know what the crack spread is. And because they are the purchasers of the crude, they do have an impact on the profitability. As far as the refining process goes, I want you to remember that the Gulf Coast of the United States is where, like it says, 44% of the refineries are located. Remember, this is a distillation tower. These are probably the single most distinguishing trait of a refinery, and there'll be some questions about that. No questions about who owns what or how the refiners concentrated. Understand the product slate, what comes out, the major processes are involved in coming out, and very importantly, understand that all refineries, because they don't have equal amounts of all these processes, all refineries aren't equal, and very importantly, all crude is not equal either. So I would be very much up on this concept and be ready to tell me, for example, what type of crude gives a higher cut of gasoline, what type of crude gives a higher cut of middle distillates, things like that. We talked in class about the physics of the distillation tower. I would be well up on that and how it works in terms of temperature and what products tend to come out where. Nothing about cracking, nor about these other processes. Let's see, I eliminated the question that talks about that. And so that's it for downstream. As far as the regulatory segment goes, I'm not going to go over those slides because the major thing I want you to recall is what processes are largely driven by federal regulation, and what processes are largely driven by state-based regulations. Also, we spent our time in class talking about the changes to the changes to the methane regulations made by the EPA in the summer of 2020. There is a multiple choice question about it and also a short essay question about those changes. So make sure that you go back and review those documents and that you recall our discussion on that topic. Okay, let's talk about the last segment, the refining. Well, I just said refining, and what I really meant was renewables and the idea of decarbonizing the economy. These are good questions to keep in mind because they may help you answer one of the short essay questions. But remember that in the United States, we got 89% of our energy from fossil-based fuels, and worldwide it's about 85%. And so this idea of decarbonizing the economy, decarbonizing our energy consumption is going to be challenging just because it's such a huge component to it now. As far as solar goes, make sure that you understand the cost trends in solar and why. The concept of net metering, there is a short answer question about that, so make sure that you understand net metering. This is just a handy thing to know about where the wind potential is. You don't need to be able to tell me about the physics of how wind is produced or those particulars. No particular question off of this, but it's kind of nice to understand. The idea of what states have a lot of wind and why they have a lot of wind generation capacity built in those states. We had a long discussion we had a long talk off of this slide in the video. Make sure that you're up on that. We talked about what it costs to do this and the various elements, and this ROT stands for rule of thumb that you could use to develop the cost. And so I'll let you know right up front, I'm going to give you a situation where I say there's this many wind turbines in a wind farm, and this is the type of turbines that were used to build the wind turbine. When I say type, I mean how many megawatts. What was an approximate construction cost for that wind farm? So be ready for that. Then a good discussion on how electricity use varies during the day, and very importantly, the different types of sources that have traditionally been used to meet those energy demands. This is a good starting point to remember, not because there's a question, but because it will help you provide some of the answers to some of the short essay questions. Then in class, we got into, the decarbonization. We talked about the issue of power density, and you're going to want to remember that. These slides are very helpful. They can familiar with the different types. And again, we're primarily concerned with combined cycle, which is the new types of natural gas, and then not concerned about nuclear, and then wind, mainly onshore wind, and solar photovoltaic. So I'd be familiar with each of these columns, but the red box is the most important comparison, where it's equating these technologies to each other and what their costs look like. We also had a good conversation about the subsidies, so I would be familiar with the overall chart, and then the red boxes are also going to lead you into some specific test questions. Talked about, surprisingly, the CO2 emissions that are required to build an electric vehicle, and the fact that if you're using a coal-fired source, you can actually put out more carbon per mile driven, even without considering the construction-based emissions, than you would using a conventional internal combustion engine. But we talked about in class what happens when you start putting natural gas and even more so wind, solar, and nuclear into the mix, and what happens. So be familiar with this. And also with this, no specific questions here. A couple of questions about intermittency. So make sure that you're up on that and what it takes to handle that. And don't be surprised if I just don't ask for your opinion about where things are headed and ask you to make some specific comments toward those where you think things are headed. So that's it for the exam. Good luck.